Last week we pretty much we did get through 1 Timothy 3, the elders portion. But what we didn't have time for was the 2 or 3 elders' qualifications that are unique to Titus chapter 1. So what we said we'll do is just hit those real quick. One in particular that is the source. Did you check the camera? Okay. The source of some, I don't want to say controversy, but discussion and difference of opinion among some. But also, I said Titus 1, 6 through 9. Really, it's kind of, that's because 6 through 9 is the qualifications. But verse 5 is also important, and I think we could probably throw it in here. It's where Paul says, "This is why I left you in Crete," to Titus, obviously, "so that you might put what remained into order and appoint elders in every town as I directed you." So this is an indication that Paul had it in mind to appoint elders, a plurality of elders, in each place. Now, a good parallel passage for this statement is Acts 14:23. It sort of clarifies what he means by every town. In Acts 14:23, Luke says, "And when they had appointed elders for them in every church, with prayer and fasting they committed them to the Lord in whom they had believed." So, what does it mean that he appointed elders in every town? Well, it means in every church. And at whatever town there was a congregation established, that congregation needed elders. So, plurality of elders in each congregation was the ideal order of things. But then he goes in, and most of these are crossover with 1 Timothy 3. Above reproach, husband of one wife. But here's the one that we alluded to last week. If his children are believers. If his children are believers. Now, there are basically 2 schools of thought as to what this means. Some say that it indicates, it refers to the fact that the elder's children must be faithful to him. Okay? In other words, they are submissive children. Others believe that the term translated believing there means they must be Christians. Now, does Paul say that the elders' children must be Christians? Not explicitly in that way. But if we consider a few things, that seems to be what is meant here. Most likely is what is meant. First of all, believers is a very common euphemism or synecdoche in the New Testament to refer to Christians. You got believers and you got unbelievers, right? I mean, those who believe are generally, that is used of those who have been baptized into Christ and therefore have obeyed the gospel and are Christians. Wayne Jackson made a few good points as far as reflection here. He says, first of all, if merely small children or those who trust their parents are in view, why would Paul add that the child's conduct must not be characterized by riotous and unruly behavior, which he does, that's the rest of that verse. His children are believers and not open to the charge of debauchery or insubordination. Well, that would seem a little redundant, if he means his children must be submissive to him, but they also, and not open to the charge of insubordination. It seems a little unnecessary to go on to add that if that's what he already meant in the first part.
Being believers would imply that they're not little children.
Also, yes, that's also implied, if that's what Paul means. Second, he says, why would the text require upright moral conduct and yet leave open the issue as to whether the children had been responsive to Christ, to whom obedience is required above all? And third, if these household qualifications are designed to demonstrate something about the elder's qualification of spiritual leadership, why would that not include leading them to the Lord when they're old enough to accept that responsibility? And so, because of these things, some scholars see this as one who has his children are to be those who have obeyed the gospel and become Christians. And that seems to fit. Now, this is not without its difficulties in real life, how this plays out. There may be men who are more than qualified in all these other respects to be an elder, but maybe their children aren't Christians. And, that sort of opens up since it can't be said that 100% without question, that's exactly what Paul means here, it wouldn't be right to be so dogmatic about it that you disqualify someone who may very well be qualified based on Paul's qualifications, because since he doesn't explicitly say it as and your translation may vary even in that. His children are believers. Some might say his children are faithful, something like that.
And it brings up a question of, does that mean while the children are under the parents' control, for lack of a better word, or there comes a point when your children are no longer, the children's on their own and the parent doesn't have control of them?
Yeah, so that opens the question of, okay, what about when they leave home? Well, I think the general consensus would be and I would say not even necessarily once they leave home, but once they're of age. But especially once they leave home, you can't really pin any choices they make on the parents. Now, again, this is touchy because it may be that the parents are indirectly responsible for the direction their children go once they leave home, or it may be that their parents have absolutely nothing to do with any choices they make once they leave home. So it's like, how do you determine? Well, that's the gray area.
They can't be open to the charge of debauchery or insubordination. So I guess to some extent their conduct matters, obviously, regardless of their age.
Yeah, and I would argue, based on that stipulation, that if a child leaves home, goes to college maybe, and just develops this reputation of being an all-out party kid that's always doing things, that is going to reflect poorly on that man, isn't it? Whether it's his fault or not. If his children have a reputation for being a certain way, even when they're grown, it does, whether it's justified or not, it is going to present some question marks as to that man and his parenting. Like I said, whether it's right or not, it is going to reflect on the man's ability, or whatever word you want to put there.
Now, I'm not a Greek scholar, but when it says children that believe, if you go back to Mark 16, 15, 16, whoever believes is baptized. Believe carries with it the fact that you are believing in Christ.
Yeah.
You're going to obey Him. Believe has to include obedience, or it's worthless. And so I would assume, again, I don't know what the Greek word is.
Yeah, it's the same Greek word. It's just the Greek word that means believe. And, that's my opinion, that since that word is usually used to refer to those who have obeyed the gospel, I don't see any reason to interpret it any other way in this verse. So, and we have to keep in mind, this has no bearing whatsoever on this man's value as a Christian, or his personal salvation, but only on his fitness to be an elder. So it's not meant to look down on this man, but it's just these are stipulations and qualifications for for serving as an elder. So it doesn't mean he has to be kicked out of the church or anything, but this is specifically about serving as an elder. Yes, Dean?
Well, too, now, especially this day and age, maybe, we know there's some, the children are born indolently handicapped. So, would that disqualify? Say, if the child is capable, we know individuals that have children and where they can't. I mean, and the thing is, they're saved anyway. God's taking care of it.
Yeah.
As far as I'm concerned, but would that, disqualify a man from being an elder or not? So
That's one of the sticky things. So Dean said, what about a man who has a child that's mentally handicapped? Now, let's say he has other children, okay? So let's say he's got 3 kids. 2 of them are Christians. 1 of them is mentally handicapped. This sort of leans into the question of another gray area. What if he has 3 children and 2 of them are Christians and 1 of them is not a Christian of their own choice? Well, does that qualify him as having children that believe? So it kind of comes down to, what does it mean? Does having children that believe mean all his children have to be Christians? Or does it mean, well, he does have children that believe, technically. Now, all his children aren't. I think these are just some of these difficult circumstances that are going to have to be determined by the man himself and the congregation and the eldership, the existing eldership. If the congregation is satisfied that 2 out of 3 of his children are Christians, then you might consider moving forward with his consideration. If the congregation is as a majority absolutely say no, he doesn't qualify, then for the sake of unity, you would probably need to just look elsewhere. And it's that kind of thing that ideally the man in question would himself remove his name from consideration for the sake of unity, even if it's not right, because of the not lack of clarity, but because of the question marks in that. So and you could ask the same question of, what if he has 2 children who are, in their upper teens, and they're both Christians, but his wife gave birth very late, and they have a toddler.
That's like 15 years.
It's the same question of, okay, well, he has 2 children that are Christians, but one of them is still a child. What do you do there? Again, that will just have to be based on conscience and best judgment, determined what's best for the congregation, etc.
Well, the Holy Spirit could choose to use the term all children, right?
Yeah, that is true.
So,
But his children would kind of,
Yeah, again, it depends on translation. So some of the translations say, having children that believe.
which that's more.
Whereas the ESV, as you see on the screen, says, his children are believers. So that would seem to imply all his children. Because if his children are believers, at the same time, having children that believe is much more loose, as far as that goes. So it's uncertain, and therefore it's better to err on the side of caution. I believe always err on the side of caution. If the congregation has 5 elders already, it's not as dire, it's not as urgent if you have to put on hold considering this new man to the eldership. But if in a situation like ours, we only have 2, and if the case were that that eldership will be dissolved sometime, then we might feel the need to judge differently, not twisting the scriptures so that we can maintain an eldership, but just circumstances do make a difference in matters of uncertainty. One last question on this subject. What about a man who has only 1 child? So, exactly. Some people would say, well, he doesn't have children. He's got a child. I thought, here's a good illustration, I thought.
Are you a parent? You're a parent.
Yeah.
How many kids you have?
Here's an illustration from E.M. Zur in his commentary. He says, the captain of a sinking ship orders that women with children should enter lifeboats first. This does not mean that women with only one child will be denied entrance. So women with children, or I could ask right now, how many of you have children? And does anybody here only have one child? Ron does. Ron only has one child. I bet you would raise your hand, wouldn't you? If I said, do you anybody in here have children? Ron would raise his hand. He's only got one child. He still has children. He still has children. So.
When you go to the form to fill out on it, I ask you, how many children you got?
Yeah.
I mean,
Do you have children on a form? Yes or no? Whether you have one child or 18 children, you're going to check yes. So it's a silly thing that, shouldn't even have to be brought up. But it does because some people might make a deal out of that. So his children, however many he has, are believers. Now, I think the only other ones perhaps are, in verse 8, he says, he must be a lover of good. That one's not explicitly mentioned in 1 Timothy 3. What that means is, in fact, some translations add the word men there, but it's not there. It's just a lover of good. So good things, good teachings, good people, whatever is good, an elder is to be a man who loves that, loves what is good, whatever the thing is that's good. And that kind of goes with hating what is evil, but he must be a lover of what is good and right. And then he goes into a little bit more detail when he says, he must hold firm to the trustworthy word as taught, so that he may be able to give instruction in sound doctrine and also to rebuke those who contradict it. So he said in 1 Timothy he must be able to teach. Well, here it's almost quite a bit of additional information there. Hold firm to the trustworthy word as taught. There's another reference to holding to what the apostles taught them that I try to make note of every time it pops up. What you received from us, the gospel that you heard from us, and so on. And here's why: because the elder needs to be able to instruct people in sound doctrine, and also needs to be prepared and able and willing to go up against those who might contradict it. So false teaching, error. And he goes into a little bit more detail after that, but we'll save that for when we get there in Titus in 10, the next few verses. Many insubordinate, empty talkers, deceivers, so-and-so, so on. All right, now, back to 1 Timothy 3, because now we get into qualifications for deacons. Deacons. A deacon, it's from the Greek word diakonos, which simply means a servant. So a servant of any kind can be used. It's not the word for slave. That's a different Greek word that is sometimes translated servant, depending on your translation. In fact, I think most of them might say bondservant for that word, but this word is different. It can be used in a generic way for just any servant in the church or otherwise, or in this case, it can be used of a specific servant. Those who had charge of the temporal affairs of the church. That's who we're talking about.
But it says likewise, meaning it's like in the same way, like obviously going to be very similar to the elder.
Yeah, overseers have certain pre-qualifications that they must meet, and deacons also must meet these things. And some of them cross over. Some of them are worded a little bit differently. It is also, deacons are those who have charge of, one who has charge of and who distributes the money collected. Acts 6 comes to mind. They're not explicitly called deacons in that text, but based on the description of deacons and what those men were doing, they were effectively the church's first deacons. That whenever the widows weren't, the Grecian widows were being neglected, and so Peter and the other apostles said, wouldn't be right for us to do that. We're going to devote ourselves to the word and prayer. But you choose men, and we'll appoint them to be over this work. Yes, sir.
You know, when it's elders and deacons, you don't want to, I guess, discourage them from not, what we, feel like that, and some people, if you do it the wrong way, and you're just angry at a person, I don't think should be qualified, that's it. You don't give no, you know, I mean, a person can get discouraged.
Yeah.
I mean, when a person is wanting to be a preacher, elder, deacon, you see
Yeah.
it the wrong way, it can cause havoc in hard feelings.
Yeah, don't want to do that. Try to be as gentle and gracious as possible, and encouraging, in time, somebody who's not qualified, especially for the physical things like being married or having children that believe. In time, that man will hopefully be fit. And so you don't want to discourage him. Yeah. Do you have something else?
Well, I know, when they appointed elders a lot of times, they always give the congregation a chance to, if you have anything, against them, to go ahead and say something. They'll set a time when they're going to do it, and you've got plenty of time to say anything.
Yeah.
And I know it happened that where we were there at King Street, that nobody said anything till the last minute. They was getting ready to appoint.
Mm-hmm.
My dad was there because he went ahead and appointed, because they waited. It's too late then. I mean, you're going to, if you got something to say, say it.
Yeah.
But now don't wait until the last minute. And then, now this is really something really scriptural, but this wasn't that.
Yeah.
But and that's just it. I mean, we have the right to do it, but we got, there's a time to do it.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Always an ideal way to do things, optimal way. So really, when we consider what a deacon is, in an ideal world, elders are the men who would be attending to the spiritual and eternal matters of the church, tending the flock, feeding the flock, seeking and gathering strays. And like I said, in an ideal world, the elders would not even have to be bothered with, on a day-to-day basis, the more physical, temporal things like finances and groundskeeping and anything that's temporal and earthly. Ideally, there will be men appointed to oversee. It's all under the oversight of the eldership. Everything the deacons do is under the oversight of the eldership, but that doesn't mean they have to be involved with the hands-on, everyday micromanaging. That's the point of appointing men to do those things, is so they can focus on the spiritual needs and eternal matters of the church. So that's who we're talking about here when we're talking about deacons. And so deacons must likewise be dignified, not double-tongued, not addicted to much wine, not greedy for dishonest gain. They must hold the mystery of the faith with a clear conscience. Okay. The word translated dignified, or some say grave, it means venerable, reputable, dignified. And one scholar said it represents not only earthly dignity, but that which is derived from a higher citizenship, a heavenly one. So, heavenly dignity, spiritual dignity, that all Christians should have, by the way. But in order to be a deacon, he must have that. Interesting word here, double-tongued. This is the only time that this word is found in the New Testament. not double-tongued, or the word is double-tongued, but he says not double-tongued. What do you think double-tongued might mean, might be?
Double-sided.
Okay, double-sided.
Maybe that'd be, you speak one to somebody one thing, then
Yeah.
turn around to another person and say just the opposite.
Yeah, on the same subject, you say this to this person, and you say the total opposite to this other person about the same thing. Well, that's double-tongued. You're speaking out of both sides of your mouth. It's kind of like being two-faced. It's a similar concept. Just an interesting word, double-tongued.
And the snake in this tongue split.
Yeah, some reptile or lizards and snakes, you think of a forked tongue. Don't know if that has any connection or not, but it does come to mind, the split tongue there. The idea here is talking two different ways, or different ways, maybe more than two, to suit the company you're in. So when you're with this group of friends, you talk this. When you're with this group, you talk something else. But yeah, that's what I said. Thank you.
That reminds me of what happened to Peter when Paul rebuked him.
Yeah.
He was about doing the same thing while when the people came from Jerusalem.
Yeah. He acted different. Yeah.
He acted different with the Gentiles in that sense.
Yeah, the difference here, I said it's like two-faced, but Peter in that case was kind of being two-faced. But the difference in this instance is he specifically seems to be referring to speaking, because that's what you do with your tongue. So being double-tongued, being two-faced is kind of like you act differently depending on who you're with. But
This would be like talking out of both sides of your mouth, people say. Or,
yep,
Did you already say that?
yep, I did.
I tend to voice it after something.
You're reading, aren't you?
Yeah.
You're reading while I'm talking. That's yes. So you say one thing to one person or one group of people, you say another thing. That's not a healthy habit. It's not an honorable thing. And we're not talking, knowing how to speak to certain people versus other people like Jesus did. We're not talking about a skill in communication. We're talking about you say one thing on the same subject, and then you go and say a different thing, like something just, I like this. And then you're talking to these people, you say, I don't like whatever this is. The same thing. I like ice cream. I don't like ice cream. This is how I feel about this. And then you say, I feel the exact opposite, depending on who you're talking to. That's not a good thing. That's not a good, it's not a good habit. It's not a good character trait. And Paul says somebody who's like that is not suited to be a deacon for whatever reason.
That's lying.
Yeah, it's pretty much lying. They can't both be true.
Well, the thing is, like I said, a lot of these qualifications applies to a regular Christian.
Yeah.
They're not supposed to be double-tongued either.
Yep. Yeah, every Christian should aspire to all of these. It doesn't disqualify you from being a Christian. Now, that's not to say that it's okay, but that's just something that needs to be changed and corrected if you're like that. It's sort of like simply being insincere. It's a pet peeve of mine, personally, where you just don't know. You don't know what to believe when somebody's talking because you never know what they're going to say. You don't know, okay, which one's the actual truth? Like a politician, for instance. But next up is not addicted to much wine. Now, we've already touched on this with the elders, but talk about silly. I've heard some try to suggest that since the wording is different for deacons than elders, that I guess it's supposedly more acceptable for a deacon to drink more alcohol than an elder. Because with an elder it says, not given to wine. But with the deacon it says, not given to much wine.
Then how much alcohol can just regular Christian drink?
Yeah, I don't know. I guess there's no limit. But
Did the Holy Spirit put much in?
Yeah, much is in there with deacons. Here's what I would say, and it's the same argument I made with the elders one. To say that he can't be addicted to much wine, to try to say that that means that it's okay to be addicted to a little wine is the most ridiculous, absurd thing I've ever heard. Because it says much.
Why do you say that when it says it qualifies much?
Because there's no way to quantify or to.
Plus, the way addiction works is that's not really the addiction doesn't work. Like you're just addicted a little bit to something.
My argument would be not given to much wine and not given to wine is the same thing, essentially, in practice. Yeah, the wording is different, but in practice, why would it be okay to be addicted to a little bit, but not addicted to a lot? That just doesn't follow in my opinion, at least.
How would you monitor that? How would
We're
you?
using the term addiction. Some people might say you're addicted to Coca-Cola, but I can hate it or leave it.
Yeah.
Some people
And I look at the alcohol the same way. In other words, if a person doesn't have to have it, he's not depending on it.
Well, alcohol does affect you different than wine, though.
You mean Coke?
Coca-Cola doesn't affect you the same way wine.
Yeah, I would say how much is much. There's the problem of, okay, how do I know if that's what Paul meant, that it's just don't be addicted to much? Well, how much do I know is much? So where do I draw the line?
To where it takes control of you. In other words, when you can't reason, when you can't function fully.
And that starts with the first drink.
Right.
Yeah,
How would you police that? How would you police that? Be monitoring them at their house every night to see how many drinks they have?
once you're addicted to it or given to it, whether it's much or little, it seems the line has been crossed. And that's why I don't think that grammatically there's any difference between addicted to wine or addicted to much wine. It seems that he's getting at the same thing, the same idea. And nothing good can come of it anyway. And that should be enough for a Christian to consider, not just a deacon or an elder. So,
But their alcohol back then was totally different than what we're having.
yeah, the wine they had back then would take an unthinkable amount. It would take a ridiculous amount to make somebody drunk compared to what we have today. Because there's only so much natural fermentation that can take place. And then, even then, they had the practice of watering it down if it had started to ferment, specifically to avoid that effect. So, and as I pointed out, there's also the medicinal angle to take into consideration. So if you're somebody who doesn't have it under control by first century standards, which is totally different than 21st century standards, somebody who doesn't have it under control back then would be somebody who can't just leave it to medicinal purposes, who can't just leave it to whatever other purposes it might be used for, but who is consuming it on a regular basis. That person has lost control of it by first century standards. Yeah, David?
You know, see, that's
Nope.
qualifying regular, whether that's once a week, once a month. So you're putting qualifications in here that I don't see that the Holy Spirit's done. I don't drink. I'm not trying to promote it, but I'm still trying to see where the word denies any.
We're saying back then,
Well, it
they
takes
might
more
have
time
used.
to ferment back then. That would probably be why they said much more. Because it would take a lot more to accomplish the inebriation.
Look too, that you're setting an example, so if someone sees you doing it, they might do it, and you get hooked on it.
True. It wouldn't look good, to say the least, for elders or deacons for that matter.
And you can't be clear-minded or sober-minded or.
Yes, that too. David, do you have something?
Yeah, is it in this epistle or the next one, Paul tells Timothy,
Yeah.
number one, for the coming days?
Yeah, it's later in this one, yep. I think. Well, maybe it is second. I thought it was in 1 Timothy 5, but it's in one of them. I thought it was in chapter 5, and 2 Timothy doesn't have a chapter 5, but I might be wrong. But yeah, there he says to use a little bit for his stomach's sake. We don't really need to do that today. We have other things for our stomach's sake. But at any rate, remember, these are spiritual qualifications, and I think the reason that Paul is so what's the word I want to use? Careful and loose.
1 Timothy 5:23.
Okay, 5. Yeah.
Says to drink no longer water, but use a little wine for thy stomach's sake.
Yeah.
And thy frequent infirmity. So it's qualifying with infirmity.
Yeah.
I just wonder if Luke that was telling Paul to tell Timothy, since Luke was a physician.
Yeah.
He was a
Yeah, Luke could have done that. Yeah.
companion. So I mean, he was prescribing it. So I mean, so that, like I say, we know that Paul, he wasn't a physician. How would he know that?
Yeah.
I think, of course, now we know that the Spirit can tell him that, as far as that goes.
Mhm.
I think Luke was in on a little bit of this. And we know that that's just like trying to say, well, how close, what's a little sin?
Yeah.
How to get close, and just like Paul, he always used the illustration that there was a company that was going to hire a wagon, asked her to drive a team down a cliff, down a narrow on the side of a hill. And the one guy tried to get as close to the edge of it as he could, and the other one, he got as close to the inside as far as he could go. Well, which one did they hire?
Yeah.
They hired the one that was stuck close to the inside. Because this has, because you can get, a lot of people try to see how close they can get to sin, and they're still not sin, or it's sin.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a good illustration of that. We'll see more about that when we get to chapter 5 on the concept in general. But for qualifications for deacons, he says, don't be given to or addicted to much wine. And then also, similar to what he said with the elders again, not greedy for dishonest gain. So, like he said, not a lover of money. Similar thing. Don't be greedy. He shouldn't be, especially if he's going to be handling some of the church's finances and things. Obvious reasons for that. And then they must hold the mystery of the faith with a clear conscience. We already looked at that with the elders just a second ago from Titus. Same thing here. Holding to the great doctrines of the Christian religion and teachings of it. Hold it firmly with a good conscience, clear conscience. Verse 10 sort of helps to nail down what I've said about pre-qualifications. These should be seen as pre-qualifications because he says, let them also be tested first. Then let them serve as deacons if they prove themselves blameless. So I don't see why this would not apply to elders as well in principle, that they need to be tested first. How else could a congregation determine whether or not a man meets the qualifications if he's not tested? And then, if he proves himself, then let him serve as a deacon, and I would argue elder as well. And then we'll skip to verse 12, where he continues the qualifications. Let deacons each be the husband of one wife, managing their children and their own households well. So, a couple of questions here. How many children does a deacon have to have? Well, we already handled that with the elders. But here's another question. Does a deacon have to have children at all? You could argue that he only has to manage his children well if he has children. Now, 10 years ago, I would have said that's absolutely incorrect. It says he must manage his children well, and therefore he can't manage his children well if he doesn't have children. Today, I would lend a little bit more sympathy to that argument. However, err on the side of caution, it would be better if the man had children, because that would certainly fit better in with what Paul says explicitly. So once again, it would be a matter of, if it was me, and I actually was in this position, 15 years ago, before Carson was born, I wasn't considered to be a deacon because I didn't have children. But if I had been, I would have hopefully said no, because I don't meet the qualifications. But then as soon as Carson was born, I became a deacon. Because here's the difference. There's no qualification at all for his children, a deacon's children, other than they must be under the submission of the father. That seems to be implied with he must manage his children well and their own households, his own household well. So the most careful interpretation is he simply has to have at least one child to be considered to be a deacon. 4, he says, I think we already dealt with this before or a couple weeks ago about the women. He kind of throws it in verse 11. And the context would definitely mean wives. Their wives must also be some things: dignified, not slanderers, sober-minded, faithful in all things. So the point we made with that was a man's wife can disqualify him, and there doesn't seem to be any reason to limit this to the deacons' wives. Why would he put qualifications on deacons' wives and not elders' wives? So when it says their wives, there's a very good possibility or probability that he means all of their wives, elders and deacons alike. Must be some things. And dignified, that same word he already used for the deacons. Not gossips or slanderers. Sober-minded, and then faithful in all things. That's a pretty big one. The wrong kind of wife can ruin any elder or any deacon, a very wise man said very wisely.
Of course, that also would apply to a Christian too.
Yeah, same thing would apply, yep.
If you had the wrong wife, you build you up and destroy it.
Absolutely. Verse 13 then says, "For those who serve well as deacons gain a good standing for themselves and also great confidence in the faith that is in Christ Jesus." So I think that seems to maybe point towards the ideal situation of a deacon will hopefully one day qualify to the eldership. So he's making a good standing before the congregation and before the Lord for that matter, and also growing in his own faith and confidence in the faith. Yes, sir.
I heard a story one time, I guess it's true, but anyway, a man, he had several theories on how to raise children. Well, then later on, he ended up getting married, and then he had several children with no theories.
Didn't work out, huh?
No, my child would never resemble me.
Yeah.
Every child is different.
Yep. Parents have to be flexible and know how to best deal with those differences in children. It's part of parenting, maybe the hardest part of parenting, recognizing that. Okay, very quickly, as we're running out of time, these two verses we've already dealt with some because I chose these as sort of the grand thesis of the whole letter. Paul says, I hope to come to you soon, but I'm writing these things to you so that if I delay, you may know how one ought to behave in the household of God, which is the church of the living God, a pillar and buttress of the truth. This is like one of those verses that is a sermon unto itself. How one ought to behave in the household of God, and that's the church, which he says. The household of God, which is the church of the living God. And then he says something else about the church. It's a pillar and buttress of the truth. The church is the pillar and buttress of the truth. It is the ground of the truth. The truth cannot be found outside the church. And the household of God, the church is the household of God. The household of God. He only has one. There is no other household of God. Just as he got done talking about how the households of the deacons and the elders, who is under the household of who's in the household of the deacon and the elders? Who's in there? Okay, children. Well, who's in the household of God? God's children. Can God's children be found anywhere else than in His household? No. And that's a pretty powerful point to consider. That's why we want to bring people into the household of God, which is the pillar and buttress of the truth, not falsehood. Then he says this, great indeed, we confess, is the mystery of godliness. He was manifested in the flesh, vindicated by the Spirit, seen by angels, proclaimed among the nations, believed on in the world, taken up in glory. He is obviously Jesus in the context there. He doesn't say that, so it's kind of confusing, but as soon as he says manifested in the flesh, it's clear he's talking about Jesus. So there's a sermon unto itself too, I guess, in a way, about Jesus. Manifested in the flesh, vindicated by the Spirit, seen by angels, proclaimed among the nations, believed on in the world, and taken up in glory. That'd probably be a 2-part sermon.